I didn't want to interrupt our holiday. Brothers and sisters were in the sky together. If briefly the sun was sinking below the horizon in the west, the moon followed not far behind, slowly chasing the day away. It was a strange orange crescent that night. Its tips pointed directly like a bull getting ready to charge. Old people called it a dry moon and said bad times were coming. As if the curfew, the patrols and the loyalty brands weren't bad enough, Aladdin thought cynically, but the moon was also beautiful with stars beginning to come out and around her and the palms below, waving in the hot wind. At least that's what he told himself and Abu. This heist was going to be trickier precisely because it was at dusk. The peacekeeping patrols were just setting out, so the streets were empty. There was no chance of using the watering of the camel's plough or the angry merchants arguing gambit or a flock of wayward goats ruse to distract the drivers of the caravan. Injured children would have to do a girl lying in the street, moaning in pain and grabbing her leg. In some ways this was actually better in the early evening because she would have been more reason to be terrified, not wanting to get left by herself to be found by the patrols. This was the big one, the caravan from Carcosa. In it they could almost certainly find Al-Azif. Keeping that out of the Jafar's hand was pivotal in the war they had planned to wage against the sorcerer to take back the city. Once he got it and began to raise the undead, things would be a lot harder. And besides the obvious advantage of depriving Jafar of a weapon he was counting on, a victory against all the powerful sorcerer would be huge for morale. It would be a sign of rest of Agrabah, that their good guys could win and that in turn would drive even more people over to their side. Jafar would begin to feel vulnerable. There would only be a matter of time before they could defeat him entirely. Aladdin waited on a rooftop, watching the wagons that appeared off the horizon grow larger and larger. The warm, dry wind whipped around his face, bringing resonance. Did I just hit my child's shower? I think I did. Scent of the desert scrub with it. He wished Jasmine could be there next to him, just the two of them sharing a quiet moment on a rooftop together, like they were originally supposed to, just a short time ago. When she was just a rich girl in disguise, slamming it, and he didn't even have a name. Yeah. He sighed, kicking his dry, bare feet against his dry mud roof. One day there would be time. When all this was over, when Jafar was overthrown and the city was theirs and Jasmine was Sultana. In situating her reforms, yes, there'd be plenty of time for hanging out on rooftops. Right now she was back at the lair, working on plans to attack the palace, and Mer had brought in lead Al-Kamak to discuss explosives. Morgana had organised the sudden influx of new recruits, dividing them into squads. Duban was in charge of tactics, along with a new guy named Sohrab, who had defeated squads. Duban was in charge of tactics, along with a new guy named Sohrab, who had defeated the Royal Guard. He defected the Royal Guard. Maraf managed to flow off supplies to the Insect Army and continued the generosity to families who support the resistance. Aladdin was in charge of making trouble, of course. He was leading tonight's raid. The wagon stopped just inside the city gates. A girl lying on the ground cried up for them to help her. "Please, esteemed Effendi, give me a ride anywhere, even a few blocks to an empty house you see, so I might seek refuge from the night and the peacekeeping patrols." That was Aladdin's cue. He leaped down lightly, Abu beside him. The drivers, although strangely pale and hollow-eyed, were predictably more annoyed by the interruption of their routine than concerned for the little girl's safety. They got down to move her just a few metres out of the way and damn her fate to the patrols. So Aladdin didn't feel too bad when Morgana and Juban slipped out the shadows behind the drivers and knocked their backs off their heads with their silent leather-covered clubs. The plan was to tie them up somewhere after drawing all sorts of strange insignia on their clothes, as if they'd been magically subdued by a rival sorcerer. As much as Aladdin didn't like those who worked for Jafar, he didn't want to see them lose their lives because they failed their master. Street rats melted out the scenery, hoisted the guards between them and disappeared again. Aladdin gently took the reins of the led camel, whispering and clicking his tongue. A little unnerved by the turn of the events, the animals immediately followed their new human master. He would probably, like all humans, give them water and food. Abu leaped on the back of one and chittered like he was driving the whole caravan himself. Aladdin led them back out the gate and round the outside wall. If Agrabah was quiet at night, the outskirts of the desert were silent as death. The insects and the little chirping lizards and animals that usually called through the dark hours were still. The only noises came from the winds whispering through the dry grasses. Aladdin found himself shivering despite the heat and was relieved when they came to the crack in the wall where a whole crowd of street rats were waiting to come and load all the books and artifacts at once in one long human chain. He patted the lead camel on her neck. "We'll get you all watered in a moment," he promised, before going to the back of the cart and throwing open its cot flaps. There were crates and urns and even Western-style barrels. Oh my gosh! Children, I'm so sorry. Right. Before going to the back of the car and throwing open its cloth flaps, there were crates and urns and even Western-style barrels, sealed tight for the trip. Someone handed Aladdin a metal-tipped construction hook, and he went to work immediately, prying the lid off the first of the crates. It was filled to the top with ancient mouldering rocks. He stared at the beige and grey desert stones, chunky and warm. They were all jumbled together like a giant child had picked up a handful of pebbles and stashed them away, pretending they were precious gems. He opened another crate. More rocks. He brought the tool down on a claim and Vorma, smashing the top off. Instead of holy water or magic potions or even wine or beer, sand poured out into a fine stream that mockingly replicated the thing it replaced. Aladdin stared at it for only a moment before reacting. "Get out!" He spun round and shoved the smallest street rats in front of him, trying to make them move faster. "It's a trap! Get out! Run! Hide!" Malicious laughter rose all around them. It grew like a dust storm from the desert, from the city walls, from the streets, from the very air itself. "Did you really think your little treacheries would go unnoticed by me?" Aladdin tried not to pay attention to the voice of Jafar, as if he concentrated on getting the children away. He picked two up on a camel and whacked its flank, causing it to scream in annoyance and gallop off into the city. "Me, the Sultan of the city and the greatest sorcerer in the world, you thought you could hide from me?" Duban and Morgana had abandoned the original plan. Upon hearing the voice, they just left the unconscious guards and run to find Aladdin. They helped scatter and send off the rest of the street rats. "We have to warn Jasmine," Aladdin said as the last little thief ran off. "She's back at your hideout." In a silent answer, Jasmine herself stepped out the shadows, looking a little guilty. Aladdin threw his arms around her and squeezed so tightly he was almost afraid of breaking her. He kissed her hand. "And here I was thinking you'd be angry I came to see one of your heists," she said with a rueful smile. "I'm just glad you're safe with me. But other people are at the hideout," Jasmine said. "Maruf and Shirin and Ahmed and everyone else not here. We should go back." "No one has turned over its location yet," Morgana said uncertainly. "Did you see the street rats really think you could talk to the genie right under my nose, as it were? The genie whom I control. Oh yes, Jasmine, I caught him coming back from your little tryst. He didn't want to tell me anything, not without giving me up my last wish for it. Of course, it took me a while to convince him, for longer and with far more torture than I expected." Jasmine went pale. Aladdin put his arm around her waist and she swayed, sick with shock. "But in the end, he told me everything about your little plan, and with the help of some branded ones, I've learned about the location of yours, and I use this term loosely, headquarters. My scouts are already turned from Carrasco's as if already in my possession. This was just to lure you out, leaving your hideout completely unprotected." "My father," Duban said, eyes wide open. "The children, we have to go back," Morgana said grimly. Aladdin agreed it was probably another trap, but what choice did they have? They couldn't let Maruf and the other children perish. The four of them began to run. Jafar's voice followed them mockingly. "You still don't understand, little rats. True power is not the willpower of the people. It is not brute force or trickery or stealth or planning. All of this can be overcome with magic. Your people of Agrabah understand that. Magic brought them gold and bread and police and peace and prosperity. Magic brings pain and obedience. Magic is the only way to change a corrupt, broken system. Magic is the only true power in the world. And you have none." Aladdin didn't think he'd ever move so fast. Morgana, lighter and swifter than he, raced on ahead like a gazelle. Then came Jasmine. Duban brought up the rear as much as he huffed and he puffed. The veteran thief didn't weaken or slow his pace. "People of Agrabah, behold those who would make life hard for you. They scurry like the very rats they call themselves and escape into filth and diseased parts of your beloved city. If you would see Agrabah at peace and prosperous, I would implore you to turn into any of these villainous wretches who are trying to tear it apart." As their friends finally get close to the quarter, a strange smell began to permeate the air. It didn't come and then frayed. Like the past rubbish pile on an open sewer, it stayed as they ran. It grew stronger the closer they approached the hideout. The stench was terrible, like rotten meat, filth, decaying corpses, all mixed in the heat of the sun. Aladdin shook his head and tried to focus on running. The four of them had to veer to the left quickly to avoid hitting a peacekeeping patrol head on. The patrol turned to follow them, but in the same ominous, consent yet slow pace they walked through the rest of the city. Aladdin and Jasmine barged through the secret entrance on the hideout, first sliding down into the main room. The horrible smell was so strong here, almost overpowering in the close quarters. Jasmine held her nose and hurried into her wardroom. Aladdin pulled his vest over his face and followed close behind. That map of Agrabah was gone. It had been completely erased from the floor. The pebble buildings were strewn across the room like a giant wind had taken them. The mark of Raja on the wall ominously blurred, like someone had tried to wipe it off. Aladdin found either someone from Jafar's camp had been here, or the street rats had tried to destroy everything to keep anyone from seeing their plans. It was impossible to tell. Morgana and Dibban entered the lair by the other secret and means by Morgana and Dibban entered their lair by other secret means and ran through the rooms as their end to meet up with Aladdin and Jasmine. "It's empty," Dibban announced, trying not to breathe. "Everybody already got out," Jasmine suggested, doubtfully through a pinched nose. "What is this smell?" Morgana asked, gasping. Aladdin had no idea, but he didn't like the way things were adding up. Something was off about the whole place. Still Jafar's voice echoed through the walls. "I'm afraid that until we have quelled the terrorist group, I'll just have to keep a closer eye on everyone. I've tried the carrot and now it's time for the stick. And just in case you're wondering how serious I am about your safety, please come to the palace gates and see what left of some street rat sympathisers were caught." Jasmine turned white. Dibban looked sick. Morgana spat in anger. Aladdin wondered how bad it was, if what he imagined was worse than what Jafar had already actually done. "We should get out of here," Aladdin said, choking on the stench. They didn't even bother trying to keep their noses and movements small. The bad guys already knew where they were. The four friends burst out the entrance with daggers drawn, ready for an attack. Down the street, the palace guards were heading towards them, rising up into the air. "What the?" Dibban said, rubbing his eyes. "Is this more of Jafar's trickery?" Morgana demanded. The guards eerily hovered above the building, hands at the ready over their swords. Without even seeming to try, they arranged themselves in a military formation, 2 by 3. Their uniforms were slightly different from those of the rest of the red and black guards. Each wore thick, colourful cuffs on the end of their sleeves that were strangely patterned from a military group. "Oh no," Aladdin said with horror, recognising the design. "It's the magic carpet," Jasmine whispered. "Jafar must have cut him up." Aladdin felt sick with shame. Despite the carpet being just that, a carpet, magic had into being able to fly and having a rudimentary understanding of the world around it. Aladdin felt like he had betrayed a friend. Abu chitted sympathetically on his shoulder. Jafar had taken another mysterious, beautiful thing and destroyed it, twisting it for his own purpose. Everything he touched, he desecrated. And the guards stank. They were the source of the terrible smell. What was Jafar doing now? Forbidding baths? Jasmine pointed to the carpet of the flying soldiers. He was large and manoeuvred slightly into place at their lead. Rasul, she stammered in disbelief. "He was dead. He died that day." Aladdin bit back at a cry. It was Rasul, leading the phalanx. His eyes were red, a dead black red that somehow made them look smaller and infinitely deeper than they should have. His skin was white like an... His eyes were red, a dead black red that somehow made them look smaller and infinitely deeper than they should have. His skin was white like an insect of an old nail clipping or the fat of a long butchered sheep. His arm and his legs hung unmoving by his sides. "He is risen from the dead," Morgana said. For the first time perhaps ever, Aladdin heard fear creeping into her voice. Aladdin had never meant to kill Rasul. And the guard certainly didn't deserve this, to be turned into a ghoul. Was he in pain? Did he have any control over his actions? Did he just long to be at peace? Was he engraved at the living? Whatever happened now was, in some way, Aladdin's fault. He straightened his shoulders and shook off the nausea. Guilt he was to deal with later. Mistake he would make up for later. Right now they had to survive. The 4 street rats watched as, in the distance, more and more squadrons of slow-moving, flying soldiers assembled themselves over the city. As I said, the foolish genie really doesn't know everything. I've completely broken one of 3 laws of magic and learned how to bring back the dead. permanently. Under my control, every time one of the soldiers falls, he is replaced. Every time one of your rats falls, he adds to an army. Death is my friend in the war of Agrabah. Morgana muttered something in the language of her mother. Street rats, Jasmine. Jafar's voice became less playful and more businesslike. Even if you were managed to avoid my army, you would still do well to turn yourselves in by dawn tomorrow. Never, Jasmine shouted into the sky. We'd rather. But Aladdin touched her on the arm and pointed. A great swirling cone of sand lifted up from the desert like a tornado. Unlike a tornado, it was broad and feathery at the edges. Sand danced around it with the invisible wind and unnatural jerking motions. Suddenly it made a picture, a giant hourglass, sand pouring slowly through it. In the bottom was Maruf, Shirin, Ahmed, and desperately, silently slamming on the grass, trying to get out. Jaban made a noise in his throat, a strangled cry. By sunrise tomorrow, this little family of street rats will be dead. No great loss, but I think. But if you actually bother to care about anyone besides your own worthless selves, you will turn yourselves in before the first light of day. And then without a word or a noise or a linking echo, Jafar's voice just cut off. The sand that made up the image in the sky fell like rain. He was defeated us without drawing in a single blade. Morgana said bleak. Duban will turn ourselves in. We can't let them die this way. And then what? Aladdin asked, turning on her. Do you really think they will change anything? Do you think he will let them go like he promised? And if he did, forget it for just a moment what he would do to us. I'm thinking a quick execution and then 4 more calls for his army. What's going to happen to Agrabah? What's going to happen to everyone else? There won't be anyone left to fight him. The city will be his, one giant plane for him to experiment on. And after that, who knows? The world. I don't care about the world, Duban interrupted. All I care about is my dad and my niece and my nephew. Jasmine started to say something. Duban held up his hand. But you're right, Jafar has no reason to let them go. He has all the cards, and if they lived, I wouldn't want them to live this sort of world he is building. But what do we do? Morgana demanded. But what should we have done from the beginning? Aladdin said, grab the lamp, rescue the family, get the genie to undo all this, and everyone lives happily ever after. Oh, is that all? Morgana rolled her eyes. Didn't you hear what he said? Jasmine asked, eyes hardening as she thought about it. He didn't call us traitors or revolutionaries or instructors. He said death is my friend in the war of Agrabah. He thinks it's a fair fight. He thinks we're at war as equals. Well, if war is what he wants, we'll give him one. Right, guys, this phone's about to die, so I'm going to have to swap phones over. So, I will be back in a moment.